Welcome to our webinar series on the business lifecycle. We have a series of 3 webinars, this one being focusing on the growth phase. Just for awareness, it will take sort of 35-40 minutes to run through, and there'll be a recording available afterwards, which you'll receive a link to. By way of an introduction, my name is Rob Krupa. I'm a director for Menzies in our Solent office. I'm in our accounts and advisory team, and I sit on our technology sector. And today I've got Laura with me.
Yeah, morning everyone. My name's Laura. I'm a director in the advisory team at our Woking office. Work with owner-managed business across a variety of sectors, but also have a specialism in hospitality and leisure. Just to start by saying that it's not been easy for many owner-managed businesses over the last few years, and we definitely recognise and see that, especially in the hospitality and leisure sector, which I'm involved in. And this has made growth quite challenging. However, with inflation and interest rates kind of starting to settle, we are hopefully starting to see some more opportunities for growth. So if you are looking to grow, or you're already experiencing perhaps some growing pains, then this morning we hope to offer some practical tips and some insights to help you along that journey. There is a QR code here just to give you an opportunity if you want to use that. It redirects to our website for further insights and also information on the next 2 webinars when they become available. To put this in context, a typical business will go through the following stages of its life cycle. So from startup through the growth phase, into a period of maturity, and then into succession, exit, decline, and timing. That is always very interesting. There'll be another webinar on exit. Today we're focused on the growth phase, as Rob already said, and I'm going to start by just looking at what we mean by growth. So before we look at that, we just wanted to get a bit of insight from you, and a quick poll question. What is your biggest challenge in respect of growth? What is your biggest challenge? So just a minute or 2 to answer that. Is it recruitment? Is it finding new clients or customers? Is it cash flow? Is it time restraints or other? Okay. So finding new customers seems to be a big one. We'll look a little bit at that as we go through. We're seeing, and we have seen, lots of challenges to growth, as you can imagine. As I already mentioned, the landscape's not been easy. So in terms of what we mean by growth, we're generally talking about growth in profits or capital value for businesses that are trading to make money, to make profits. And growth refers to the process through which a company expands its capabilities or its resources in order to do that. Just to briefly mention a few different types of growth. So we've got organic or internal growth. So this is where a business uses its own resources to grow, as opposed to external growth, or sometimes called acquisitive growth, which occurs perhaps through a merger or an acquisition or some sort of collaborative partnership. Important to note that growth can be both intentional and unintentional. Today we are focusing on intentional strategic growth, and also on sustainable growth, which is also important to bear in mind, because growth itself can bring its own challenges, and we'll look at those as we go through. Growth strategy really provides a framework, a really important framework that guides an organisation towards its goals and towards gaining competitive edge in the market. Growing turnover isn't enough. We see a lot of clients or businesses come to us about growing turnover, very focused on that top line, but actually really need to focus on growing profits and maintaining cash. And just a little reminder here, turnover is vanity, profit is sanity, and cash is king. There's lots of different areas of a business that can contribute to its ability to support growth, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means. We won't be going over every single one in detail, so it will take all day, but we'll be picking up on some of the key aspects and the areas where we help clients the most. I'm going to start at the top of the visual here, strategy. Having a strategy is so important. So there was a recent survey, I think it was the Marketing Centre, 2,000 small, medium-sized businesses, and they found that 54% of businesses didn't have a documented business plan or strategy. Clearly, we don't want to just be relying on luck here. We want to have a documented strategy. There really is something about getting it on the page, getting it written down, documented, so that there's full visibility of where the business is looking to go. In terms of products and services, really differentiating your product, recognizing your USP or your unique selling point, allowing you to better target your customers. So a lot of you talked about the difficulty in winning new customers and clients, thinking about what that target market looks like and why would somebody buy from you and not your competitor. Again, we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through. Marketing and business development linked directly to winning new work, new clients and new customers. In the same survey that I mentioned, 67% of businesses didn't have a marketing action plan. So it's no wonder that many businesses find it difficult to grow their customer or client base. It's really important that we're tracking efforts, we're following up leads, and we have a clear and defined plan as to how we're going to approach that. There is technology available to help with this. So even if you can't afford a fully functioning, all bells and whistles CRM system, there are apps available. One that we use internally as well is something called HubSpot, which helps to track leads and prospective customers. So really leveraging on technology to help hone in on opportunities and use this in your marketing and business development plans. As accountants and advisors, we obviously like to talk about revenue, costs, and cash. Not only revenue streams, as I said before, it's really important to understand your gross profit margins by product, by service. Driving turnover is great, but if you're doing it at a loss, then you'll be very busy and all you'll be doing is eroding business value and not actually increasing it, which is just a lose-lose situation. Financial health is really critical for a business to grow, and we'll talk more about revenue and costs shortly. Cash, absolutely, cash is king, really important, especially early on in a business life cycle. Don't underestimate the level of cash that you need in order to grow your business and support your growth plans. Customers and suppliers, maintaining good relationships goes without saying. Maintaining good relationships with customers and suppliers is key and directly impacts the revenue and costs of your business. Supply chain challenges have been very common in recent years, and this inflationary environment has really squeezed margins where a lot of businesses have not been able to pass on costs to customers. Looking at ways to improve customer loyalty and retention is paramount, is helpful, perhaps with either reward systems or loyalty programs, or really just focusing on how you can provide an exceptional customer service or experience. Employees and partnerships, another very important aspect. We'll look at some of the employee points in a bit. Technology, not going to focus too much on technology today, but clearly very important. And whether you loathe it or love it, it's definitely here to stay. And if you don't stay up to speed with technology in your business, then your competitors certainly will. Technology can be used to your advantage to help streamline systems, to help improve your customer reach. At Menzies now, we actually have a dedicated digital transformation team, an advisor, recognizing how important it is that all these different systems that we're using within businesses talk to each other effectively, that we reduce labor intensive and manual processes to make sure as many processes and systems are automated and joined up as possible. AI, can't go without mentioning AI, a bit of a hot topic, but also a great tool. And I know we'll be seeing a lot more of it. It's going to be really disrupting all sectors. So we're going to need to use it to our advantage, stay on top of this technology, as it can really help to set your business apart. Managing risk in a business, absolutely crucial here. Whilst we cannot be prepared for every eventuality, so, think COVID, we can certainly review and manage and monitor the key risks of a business with a view to minimizing the impact of it. So, for example, you could look at whether you're dependent on key customers or key suppliers, and what happens if those relationships fail for any reason. Are your systems robust? Are you minimizing the risk of fraud or human error within your business? Rob will cover more on this later on. Finally, all this is great, but we need to be monitoring this on an ongoing basis in order to track progress. So financial reporting that's timely will really enable you to remain adaptable. So if things aren't quite going to plan, you can change course. And this is the key to a successful business, remaining adaptable and creating accountability, extremely valuable. So especially we see a lot of smaller businesses, especially small teams or sole directors or shareholders, creating that accountability is really helpful. So you can lean on your advisors perhaps to challenge you or help to keep you on track or accountable. Lean on staff members, any other partnerships that you have, making sure that you're all on track to meet your wider strategic goals. I'm going to look a little bit about driving business value. So when we talk about business growth or business value, we're going to look at it in terms of this simple equation. As simple in theory, it's not always simple to implement, but in principle, we understand that if we can increase maintainable profits in the business and we can decrease risk, we can increase business value. I'm going to try and bring this to life with a numerical example so you can see how this works. So when a business is valued, a trading business, typically it's valued on a maintainable profits times a risk-based multiple, which gives a business value. So if we take a set of sort of before and after figures, let's say over time we can increase our maintainable profits from 150,000 to 300,000. And at the same time, we can drive down the risk in our business, meaning that our risk multiple increases from 2 to 5. So say in year one, we've got 150,000 maintainable profits times a risk-based multiple of 2 gives us a business value of 300,000. If in 2 or 3 years' time, we can grow that profit to 300,000, reduce the risks, so our risk-based multiple goes up, we could end up with 300,000 times 5, which gives a business value of 1.5 million. So you can see that relatively small changes can result in a really big difference in that overall business value. Using that information to look at the key components of that equation, we can start with maintainable profits. So profit is a function of turnover and cost, and also driven by productivity and people. So in very simple terms, if we can increase turnover, reduce costs, and drive productivity, we can increase our maintainable or sustainable profits. Very simple in theory, can be very difficult to implement. Talked a little bit about turnover or revenue before, not just about understanding your various revenue streams, but really the underlying profitability of those revenue streams. So which are your most profitable products or services? And are there some which just continually make losses? Perhaps you should consider just not being in those markets at all. Are there some that you could just get rid of and use your time more efficiently on those that do? So we've probably all heard of the 80-20 rule, maintains that 80% of our outcomes come from 20% of our efforts. So prioritizing 20% of the factors of our inputs that will create the maximum value in our business, but we need to understand where those are first. Other ways to help drive turnover, looking at perhaps diversification of products or services, bundling, putting together packages to encourage higher revenue or spend per transaction, and looking at reward schemes, ways to drive customer loyalty and bring customers back to you rather than to your competitors. In terms of costs, as I mentioned before, in this sort of inflationary environment we've been in, it can be difficult to reduce costs in some instances. And certainly if you've got fixed price contracts, really difficult to pass those on to the end customer. However, we are starting to see a little bit of change here, and perhaps fixed price contracts are coming to an end, giving you an opportunity to renegotiate with suppliers, having those conversations, really being on top of your monthly profit and loss account. So you can skim down, look at those costs which are the most significant in your business or the ones that are increasing, looking at ways you can either perhaps switch supplier or review ways of working to free up time and resource to focus on different areas. Again, are you using technology efficiently to help streamline processes to save time and costs? A good example of something we implemented recently on a client is getting an expense system in place for them. So an expense app that linked in with their bookkeeping and actually help with the recording of expenses, not only helping them to accurately pick up the costs, but helping them to accurately pick up the VAT element so that they could ensure that that was being recovered on a timely basis. Again, this real-time information is key to allowing a business to remain very responsive. In terms of people and productivity, a company is only as good as the people it keeps. So how can we incentivize and motivate them? But there's tons of different ways, and this could be a webinar all by itself. But do we have appraisal systems, mentoring systems? I recently heard about this great idea of reverse mentoring. So actually, top to bottom mentoring, which I thought was a great idea, really understanding what's going on perhaps on the ground of the business, getting a different perspective, being aware of unconscious bias in your recruitment. So perhaps just recruiting people exactly like you, not the best way to ensure a diverse workforce. That means that you're getting lots of different perspectives, lots of new ideas, recognizing that everyone's unique and that they will be incentivized in different ways. So trying to understand what's important to your staff. So whether that's bonuses, flexible benefits, pensions, perhaps share option schemes might be appropriate to incentivize key people and motivate them towards the business's strategic goals. ESG, something we're hearing more and more about, environmental, social, governance, where policies are genuine and well thought out. It can not only help the planet, but also make your business more attractive to both employees and customers. And we're seeing this creep in now. There's a lot of requirements within supply chains, to evidence this in certain areas. And many surveys have found that employees just prefer to work for companies that care about the same issues as they do. Organizations that are consistently making efforts with their ESG policies tend to see less employer attrition, so they keep hold of their staff. So where to start? I think sometimes that's the most challenging part, is it can all seem a bit overwhelming and there's a lot that you can do. But in fact, the changes don't have to be huge. And I'm a big fan of sort of looking at marginal gains and this power of small incremental changes to result in quite significant changes. Again, just bringing it to life with the numerical examples, I think it's helpful to see how this plays out in numbers. Year one sales, 4 million, let's say over 3 years, we increased that by just 1% over 3 years. Doesn't look like a huge amount. Most people probably think, okay, that's achievable with a good strategic plan behind us. Direct costs, can we edge those down by 1% each year over 3 years? Overheads, if we can also do the same with overheads, can we edge those down by 1%? 1% increase in sales, 1% decrease in direct costs, 1% decrease in overheads, net profit doubles. It goes from 150,000 to just over 300,000. Net profit from almost 4% to 7.5%, almost 8%. So the power of marginal gains is really significant. You've probably all heard the example of the British cycling team in 2002. They got a new coach, Sir Dave Brailsford, who actually looked at all the various elements that impacted the team's performance. So the obvious things were like fitness, nutrition, the aerodynamics, looking at the bike, but they really started to look at these small areas of weakness, to look at ways they could improve, to the point where, you know, they took their pillows with them away when they were training, and just to make sure that they got that extra bit of good night's sleep. And sure enough, I think they hadn't won a single gold medal in 70 years or something like that. And in the Olympics in 2008, they went on to win 7 out of 10 gold medals. So perhaps do sweat the small stuff, because actually it can have a big impact, and a much bigger impact than you might think. I'm now going to hand over to Rob, who will look a bit more about how to plan for growth and some of the barriers to growth.
Thank you, Laura. So I'm going to talk sort of around the planning elements for growth. So making sure that you're ready for it, making sure you know what's coming. What I can't express enough on this point is that planning is really important to do. So there's 3 key points on here that I just want everyone to consider. The first one is to actually get the plan. Laura's already spoken about having a documented strategy, but actually having that plan, that strategy, one of the same thing, documented and written down is really important. Not just your end goal. This isn't where we want to be in 5 years or 10 years or whatever, but how you're actually going to get there. So what are your interim targets? How will you measure what your growth looks like? Will it be sales revenue? Will it be number of customers, number of transactions, profit margins, staff numbers? It doesn't need to be a financial metric, but it needs to be something that you can sort of tangibly measure in some way, shape or form. But you need to know what your milestones are. So what you set yourself against and how do you measure those? And again, the documentation is really important on those. Second point here is don't just wait for it to happen. The chances are if you wait for growth to happen, it might not. You might enter unexpected growth, and therefore you may lose your ability to take advantage of it. You might actually be so far into a growth phase that you don't realize that, and you can't react quick enough to it. Anything you try to do at that stage might be a bit too late, and you might have missed your opportunity. If you have planned for growth, then you're going to know what to do next, or you're going to at least have a plan or an idea of what to do next, and how you're going to react to the changes of the situation that you're in. The best performing businesses that we see in our client base are those that are run by proactive, forward-thinking people. Now, that said, if you do enter unplanned or unexpected growth, it's not too late to put a plan together. So it's still better to try and plan your way through the rest of the period than it is just to drift along and see where you're going to end up. And the final point on here, which is easy for me to say as an advisor, but get yourself a good advisor. Surround yourself with good people. You're good at running a business that is growing because you're good at what you do. You can't possibly know the answer to everything, and nor should you. So selecting a good advisor or team of advisors around you and having open and honest conversations with them about what your growth looks like or what you want to achieve is really important. I'm just going to change tack slightly here and just look at what some barriers are. And the reason this is important is just to get that growth, to consider these in your growth phases when you're planning. So these are some common things that we see in our client base. Now, this list isn't exhaustive. There's loads more to consider, and we're not going to go into these in loads of detail, but we're just going to touch on a few of these. So just sort of starting at the top there, or just to the side of the top, we've got a general economy. Now, given that this is massively or largely outside of the control of the business, why do we need to consider it? Well, the reality is it's going to have an impact on you. So is an economic upturn or downturn going to have an impact on your business? Is it going to affect your customers? And if you deal with the consumer market, is it going to affect their disposable income? If you're dealing B2B, is it going to affect major buying decisions that are going to impact on your ability to sell your goods? Can you get the things, the cost of your goods at the right prices that make it sort of viable for you still to make profit? There's loads of things outside in the general economy that make a difference. Availability of supplies is the next one on here. So over the last few years, we've seen major events that have affected availability of supplies, from Brexit, COVID, the war in Ukraine, and even interest rates being how they have been over the last sort of 12 to 18 months or even longer. So can you get what you need to supply your customers? Will this become more of a problem as you grow? Is it going to be harder to get hold of things? Can you get your suppliers at the right price and at the right time to be able to compete? If you can't, that's going to have a significant impact on your ability to grow. Competition is the next one on here. So if you're in a high environment, if you're in a highly competitive environment, is that going to impact on your growth? Are you going to be able to outgrow your competitors? What's your USP? And Laura already talked about that in business plans earlier. So make sure that you differentiate yourself from your customers somehow. Is that in service? Is that in quality? Is that in price? Make sure that you do something different to your competitors. Cash flow we're going to talk a little bit more about in a moment, so I won't go into too much detail here, but it's a massive factor in growth. Regulation, another thing that's outside of the control of the business to a large extent, but just make sure you're aware of what's coming that might impact on the business. Are there current laws that affect your growth, or are there things that are going to change which will affect your growth going forward? Particularly if you're looking at international markets, regulation around the world differs greatly between countries. So just make sure that you know what the impact of that is going to be. Internal processes are a big factor as well. So can your internal processes handle a scale up? Are they strong and robust to make sure that they can cope with any growth that you're going to see? If they're loose and undefined, it may cause for a really chaotic growth phase, which is actually going to slow you down or stop you achieving what you want to achieve. Growing too fast might be a strange one to put on here, that actually fast growth can hinder your growth. But the reason that's there is we often see people who are experiencing high periods of growth and they're dealing so much with the firefighting and the here and now that they lose focus on the longer term strategic plans. So making sure that you step back from whatever you're doing right now to see whether this is in line with where you want to be is really important. Now, sometimes you need to capitalize on what's happening now, and we saw that a lot through COVID, but actually you do just need to keep a focus on the longer term. Excuse me, staff skills or staff in general are a factor that could hinder your ability to grow. Now, does your team have the right skills and experience in-house? Do they have available time to deal with growth? Are you attracting the right staff, and are you retaining your key talent? If the answer to a lot of those is no, then actually your workforce probably isn't ready for a scale up. So you need to make sure you've got something in place to deal with that. That needs to go into that plan. And physical space might seem like a really obvious one. Well, do I have enough space? Yes or no? It's a bit more to consider than just have we got enough space, because it's about the type of space that you have. Do you need more industrial type space? Do you need more office type space? If you're in what is the current work environment where there's a lot more flexible working, are you actually over capacity in your space? Do you need to downsize slightly? And the reason that that's important to tackle is, and the reason it might be a barrier, is if you've got too much space, you might be using cash flow where you don't need to. You could put that somewhere else. Now, going through these points and looking at barriers might sound like a negative exercise, but what it's actually doing is looking at things that might impact on your growth plan. Do you need to consider something that's going to prevent you from growing? And can you turn it into an opportunity and understand those factors a little bit more that will give you the edge? What we try and get clients to do in these situations is actually, when you put these into a plan, use these in something like a SWOT analysis, where you look at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of a business. Put those all into the right boxes. And then where you've got areas of weakness, can you strengthen them? Where you've got strengths, can you leverage them? And where you've got opportunities, can you take them? So what might start out as a challenging experience or exercise looking at what our barriers are, we can actually flip those around to make them a strong backbone for stable, maintainable business growth. So what are the practical considerations of this? Excuse me. We need to look at things to consider. So there are some things we need to consider now. What do we need to think about in the short term? Well, we know what our 2-year plan is. What do we need to look at in that short term? Looking at those focus areas that Laura spoke about, but also looking at our barriers. Which of those can we consider later? Well, we know that some things are going to be an issue, but we don't necessarily need to consider it in too much detail now. That can be something that comes into year 3 or 4 of our growth plan, but we need to be aware of it for later on. And then, do we need to make any changes to the business? The answer is probably yes. there's going to be some bits that come out where you're going to need to change something in your business. That might be a small change, like Laura's talking about those marginal gains. It might be a whole scale change where you fundamentally need to change a process or something about the business to take advantage of the market that you're in. And then that leads on to what do we need to do now? So some of those things that we've considered and some of those changes we need to make, we need to do in the short term. We need to do that to make sure that we're dealing with issues that we have now, taking opportunities that we've got now, but also to gear us up for future changes and opportunities that come. Sometimes we need to do that now in the view that we're going to need to be in that situation in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, 5 years' time. But then there's the what we need to do later. There will be some points we've considered for later, and there's some changes we need to make, but we don't need to do it right now. If that, for example, goes back to that physical space, well, actually, we know we need to scale up in size, but we don't need to deal with that property element for another 5 years. So we can look at that in a couple of years' time and start to plan, but we don't lose it off our focus. We still have it there. And then the last point on here, which is really important not to forget, is will any of these changes have an adverse effect on the business? There's a chance, or there's a good chance that some of them will have an adverse effect on the business in the short term. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't make the changes, because sometimes we need to make those short-term losses or take those short-term pain points for longer-term benefits. If we know it's going to happen and it's in the plan, it's not a problem. It's just part of the journey. So there are 2 areas now which I'm just going to come up through lots of phases of growth that companies, people, businesses experience, risk management and cash flow. So I'm just going to dive into those in a little bit more detail. Laura spoke about the business equation and saying that if we can reduce our risk, we can increase our value. So that makes it a really important thing to manage. Generally, when we're growing, we are exposing ourselves to increased risk. That might just be because of the number of transactions, it might be because of the value of transactions, it might be that we're entering different markets. It just changes our risk profile. This can be across a number of areas, but we're just going to touch on a few little points here that come up commonly in our client base. IP protection. Some people would see this as an obvious point, but many don't. This could be something like protecting your brands and trademarks. It could be protecting technology you're building or ways in which you work. If these areas aren't protected, it can have an impact on your ability to take a competitive advantage. It might be that your competitors actually take advantage of your IP because you've not properly protected it. So it's something that we really need to think about protecting against and having good arrangements in place to make sure that it doesn't become a risk factor for us. Terms and conditions, again, is something that probably don't get enough attention. There's a lot of businesses out there who use boilerplate terms and conditions. Now, using the boilerplate T's and C's might not be appropriate, especially if you work in a niche area of business. With increased transactions or increased growth comes the likelihood of enhanced, customer defaults, customer disputes, maybe supplier disputes, potential litigation for non-performance of duties, and your T's and C's can protect you against all those things. So make sure that you surround yourself with good advisors and that you take appropriate action on those to make sure that they are fit and proper for your business. If you enter into any disputes that are related to your T's and C's and they're not good, they literally won't be worth the paper that they're written on or the digital print that you've got, because they won't support you in what you need to do. So it's a really key thing to have in place. Now, along with growth comes a larger workforce in many instances, and that results generally in that workforce being more complex. If nothing else, it definitely results in more admin to do with the workforce. So there can be a lot to consider on this one. It could be really simple things like making sure that all your process and policies in relation to HR cover the basics for maternity, paternity leave, pay, sick pay, holiday allowances, general employment rights that people are entitled to. But it could be a little bit more complex than that, like making sure that you have a proper process to deal with complaints from the workforce, that you have a good appraisal process in place, and that it is designed to help meet the growing business needs and what you want from your staff, and that your staff are incentivized to move forward. It might be things like restrictive covenants. If you work in an area where there's a risk the workforce can take your intellectual property or your client bases and do other things, you need to have protection against that. And that can come from your HR protection. It might actually be in the HR world that you've got this IP protection. So again, if they go away and take your IP, you need to protect against that, which loops back to the first point on the slide. It might even be that any reward mechanism you've got for reward and retention is fair and isn't discriminatory in any way. Key persons is likely to be more relevant as the business grows. So there's a likelihood is there are key people in your business. It might be key management, it might be directors, but you need to protect yourself against something happening there. So what happens if one of those key people is incapacitated? What happens if one of them leaves? What happens if there's a major disagreement? Managing growth can be a really stressful environment to be in, and that can cause all sorts of disagreements, issues that can be protected against. Excuse me. The larger the business might mean that these key people become even more key. General risk here can be anything, to be honest, but I mean, Laura's already touched on over-reliance on customers and suppliers. It could be risk related to cash flow or general operational risk. There's lots of things in here that could be looked at. And there's many ways you can protect yourself against all of those things, either by taking an action or putting processes in place. So how do we manage the risks that we identify? Well, it might be that good legals are what you need. So things like IP protection, T's and C's, speak to a good advisor, they can help you out with those. It might be that you take an insurance policy. So key persons are often covered by insurance policies. If it's to do with incapacitation or fallout, then you can take a policy against some of those elements. General risk will really depend on what it is. But the key thing around all of these is going back to that, talking to your advisory team, making sure that you've got good links with people, speak to them about your plans and how that's going to work. They can put you in the right direction, they can help you identify risks, and they can put you in touch with a good advisor that can help you. So moving away from risk and we're looking at cash flow, we see this across all businesses in many cases, but particularly those that are growing. Managing cash at any time can be a challenge, but in periods of growth, there are more constraints on your cash, more things to manage, it's ever changing, and you generally have more cash outlay. A lot of the bits that Laura spoke about in the focus areas, some of the bits I looked at in terms of your barriers, they have cash implications. So if you're looking at staff, premises, suppliers, insurances, advisors, as you grow, you're likely to need more of those things, and that all sucks up cash. So being able to be on top of that and being able to know what's coming is really important. So cash flow planning is a really important tool within a business, particularly in those areas of growth. So what process would we advise? Well, first of all, plan. And we've said it already a couple of times, Laura's mentioned it, and I've already mentioned it. Make sure you plan for what's going to come. Initially outside of the cash flow. So looking at that big strategic plan, what are the implications? And then pulling out the cash elements and putting those into a forecast. So what do those figures look like? What's our top line look like? What do our operational costs look like? How can we work through all those numbers to come up with a fully integrated three-way forecast that includes a profit and loss account, a balance sheet, and a cash flow forecast? And really only having all three of those that are interlinked can you get a full picture of what's going to happen, because a change in one impacts on the others. Scenario planning is really, really key. So don't just put a plan together or forecast together and leave it there having one version of it. You need multiple versions. What happens if your growth is up 20% compared to what you think it's going to be? What happens if it's 20% down on where you think it was planning to be? What does this forecast do if things change? You know, we need to make sure that if we get a big customer in 6 months, how does that change our cash flow forecast? If we lose one, does that have a big impact? Are we strong and stable enough to cope with that? And then we review that. We go back round and go, right, where are we compared to our actuals? Are we where we thought we'd be? The chances are you won't be, because a forecast is just a forecast. It's not the reality. So the chances are 6 months in, certainly 12 months in, you're not going to be exactly where you thought you were going to be. So review that, make changes where you need to. And that's where revise comes in. Loop back round. So what's changed? Are we still on track? Are we still in line? If we're definitely not, go back round to the forecast and amend it. And then apply those scenarios to that amended forecast. Make sure that we're constantly reviewing and revising so that we're on top of where we think we're going to be. Now, sometimes in periods of growth, we need to get external cash because we can't always get it from inside the business. So how can we get more cash in our hands to help us with our growth? There's just a few areas on here. And again, as we said on all the other slides, we can't go into loads of detail. So I'll just give you some headlines on these. But if you don't get the cash when you need it, it can really hinder your growth. So bank borrowing can be a nice long-term cash flow. You'll have set terms, set repayments. Could be a good option in the longer term, especially if you've got a good trading history that enables you to get good rates on those. Overdrafts we see used quite frequently in business actually. It's not the most effective or efficient way to do it just because of the interest. But if you want a buffer, or if you're just going to dip in short term, it works perfectly for that without having to hang yourself on long-term debt that's going to sit around you for many years. External investors are a fantastic one for long-term strategic growth. The chances are with an investor, you'll get someone who is engaged in the growth of your business because they're going to see the return that comes with that. But obviously, as a business owner, you need to understand that you give up a proportion of your business to get that person in. Asset finance can be a good option as well. So if you've got assets within the business you can leverage that aren't already, this can give you good medium-term cash flow that you can repay off over a period of time. Crowdfunding works to varying degrees depending on your industry and depending on your business setup. But the good thing here is because investors can spread their risk profile, it can be quite effective and efficient for you to get external funding in. Working capital ties back really nicely to Laura's points about the marginal gains. So if you can make your debtor collection 5% better and your creditor payment terms 5% better, you can actually have a real impact on your working capital, which can give you cash in your pocket to deal with now that you can use for that longer term growth. And invoice finance. If you've got a debtor book that isn't leveraged, and particularly if you've got long payment terms on your invoices, you can use that debtor book to leverage some finance. Can be very effective and efficient. And what that means is when you raise an invoice, you can actually draw down on that pretty quickly. All of those, I would say, you need to speak to someone externally to help you understand what fits with your needs, what fits with your longer term strategic growth, and what the impact on your growth plan might be.
Right, some key takeaways. We've covered quite a lot, hopefully given you lots to think about. There is no magic wand. I think consistency is key to growth. Document your strategy. Make sure it's written down. It's clearly visible. That you understand your financials. That you understand your revenue streams, your gross profit margins. Don't underestimate the value of marginal gains. How can we become 1% better across multiple areas? Consider the barriers and the risks to growth within your business and stay accountable. Keep tracking progress. Rely on those around you as well to keep each other accountable and work towards that common goal. So hopefully that's given you a few things to think about. Do please feel free, our contact details are on the slides, which will be available afterwards. Do feel free to reach out to either myself or Rob. Going to finish with one final bit of interaction, another poll question. Anything you'd like to understand more about in your business, whether that's improving your financials, attracting and retaining key staff, developing a business strategy, or managing cash flow. Give you a moment to answer those. And finally, just to wrap up, thank you very much for listening and enjoy the rest of your day.